Chuck Walton. Today I'll be interviewing Mr. Marvin Moss, a longtime Fluvanna County resident who was instrumental in the growth of the county. We are accomplishing this and other interviews of longtime residents so that future generations can see and hear about the things that shape this county from those individuals who were actually there. Mr. Moss, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed. Could you first tell us a little bit about your background and how long you've been in the county?
Sure. I was born and raised in Western Maryland, graduated from high school there, graduated from West Point in 1959, was in the Army for 10.5 years, served in exotic places like Ethiopia, Rhodesia, Vietnam, Germany. So I lived abroad almost a decade in the 1960s. I left the Army in 1969 after coming back from Vietnam, and I started working in democratic politics. I worked for a Democratic congressman from Western Maryland, my home region, for 6 years as his legislative director, and then for 18 years as chief of staff to Senator Paul Sarbanes of Maryland. And I retired in 1995. I bought Glen Burnie, my house here in Fluvanna, in 1991 after seeing it advertised in the Washington Post. And I bought it to be sort of a weekend retreat, and I fell in love with it and decided that this is where I'm going to live the rest of my life. So from 1991 to 1995, I was still working in the Senate, and I retired in 1995 and moved down here permanently in that year. Meanwhile, I had restored Glen Burnie. Glen Burnie's an 1829 house. It had been abandoned for 18 years, so there was much work to do to make it a livable house. And as soon as I retired, I kept thinking to myself, well, what am I going to do in my retirement? I mean, was head of a staff of 60 in the U.S. Senate. It was a very busy existence, as you can imagine. And almost immediately I realized that Fluvanna County was changing dramatically. When I bought Glen Burnie in 1991, the population of Fluvanna County was 11,700 people. Today it's 28,000. And people look at me and they say, well, that's not a huge increase in numbers, but it is a radical change in terms of both the demographics and the politics and the problems that are associated with rapid growth in a rural community like this. So soon after I came down here in 1995, I said, well, perhaps I can use some of my experience, because one of the things that I was very proud of on Senator Sarbanes' staff was that we had a very close connection with the 23 counties in the city of Baltimore in Maryland, and that we went out frequently to them, reaching out to educate them about federal and other programs that they could apply for. Many of these local governments, including more rural ones like on the Eastern Shore in southern Maryland, were unaware that there were programs that could benefit them and that they could apply for, and we would help them get those grants from the federal government. So I think we did a splendid job of that. And when I arrived here and started looking around, I immediately got involved with the Fluvanna Historical Society, which I now chair. And I began to realize that the county was struggling to deal with the rapid growth. The county had had a stagnant population almost from the First World War until the beginning of the 1990s. The population had grown almost just marginally. And all of a sudden, from 1995 on, the population burgeoned, and it was creating problems. But then again, one of the things that the supervisors did in 1994, even before I moved down here, was an absolutely brilliant thing and rather atypical for a fiscally conservative rural county government to do. They paid $1 million for Glen Burnie, the property we're now sitting on, It was extremely controversial. There were lawsuits against the county for buying it. The decision was essentially made in secret, but it was a very sound decision because if you're familiar with our county seat, Palmyra, it is hemmed in by the Fluvanna River on the south, Route 15 on the east, and no room to grow in the north. So the government center for Fluvanna County was hedged in and had very little room to expand in a county's population was increasing like gangbusters. So I applauded that decision to buy Pleasant Grove, even though I had not been living here when the decision was made. The other thing that I discovered fairly quickly was that the county had no staff dealing with either writing grants or establishing a working relationship between the state government, the federal government, and private foundations. And that's, of course, what I had been doing in Washington for years. And I decided that I would try to broach changing the county's attitude towards these things by establishing some, what I call private-public partnerships between the Fluvanna government and nonprofits such as the Historical Society and the Heritage Trail Foundation. And I slowly, I think, convinced the county government, but the nonprofits, the nonprofits especially, that they had to change their attitudes because the Historical Society was very well run, and its president was an absolutely fantastic woman who's now deceased, Ellen Miyagawa. But the focus was on historic buildings, and they were not thinking more broadly about landscape, rural preservation, other things that make saving a historic building relevant. I mean, what's the use of restoring a historic building if the surrounding is absolutely incompatible with that building? And slowly, a lot of the new membership coming in began to change the point of view of the Historical Society to broaden their idea and to think of it more as a preservation organization in a much broader sense. And I think that worked quite well. At the same time, the county appointed a group of citizens, which was a brilliant move on their part, I thought, to look at Pleasant Grove and to recommend to the supervisors what its future use would be. And to my astonishment, really, that group came up with, I thought, very sound recommendations. And those recommendations were to keep it at least 60% wooded, which it is now. Don't permit any kind of construction whatsoever on the steep slopes. Maintain the watershed that flows into the Fluvanna. And the county, to its credit, immediately adopted that and said, look, yeah, you've made really sound recommendations, which was the origin of the idea of several citizens. It wasn't my idea at all. It was Julie King and some other folks who came up with the idea of building a trail system at Pleasant Grove. That started in 1996, and I immediately joined the organization. And I convinced the then directors, who was not at that stage a 501c3 nonprofit, it was just a functioning community organization. I convinced them that we should apply for nonprofit status through the IRS and through the state, and we did, and we received that status. Why is that important? It's important because private foundations are reluctant and in many cases refuse to give money to local governments, but they will give money to nonprofits. So the test of that was the first T21 Transportation Enhancement Grant, which was a grant to build the little village park up next to the post office in the town of Palmyra, to stabilize the old mill in Palmyra, which is right by the Fluvanna, hard to see today because the trees have grown up all around it, and to build the first Americans with Disability accessible trail at Pleasant Grove. It was a $100,000 grant, $80,000 coming from the federal government through the state, and the county had to match it with 20% or $20,000. And we, all of us on the Heritage Trail Foundation, garnered a lot of support from community leaders for this. It was quite a revolutionary idea. The county had almost never applied for any grants. It had no grant administrator. So we were heading off in a direction that was very, very far-fetched for a lot of local folks. At any rate, we went before the supervisors, and we carried the day by a vote of 3-2. I discovered later that one of the supervisors who voted for it only voted for it because he never thought we would get the grant and they wouldn't have to pony up the $20,000. Nonetheless, we went forward. And I think that was really the beginning of a lot of things, because we had hired a superb architect, Carlton Abbott, whose father was the principal architect of the Blue Ridge Parkway. He's one of the most famous landscape architects in the United States, and he did the master plan for the Heritage Trail, going from Palmyra to go over the new bridge, which VDOT was scheduled to replace, and into Pleasant Grove. And it was a really wonderful master plan, and it was going to be very expensive to do, but we were going to do it in sort of biteable chunks. So we did that, and it was very, very successful. People saw a new park, a beautiful park up by the post office, saw that the old mill in the village of Palmyra was not restored, but had been stabilized, and that there were new trails on Pleasant Grove. Meanwhile, a group of volunteers had cut through the woods and made a complete trail system on Pleasant Grove, to the amazement of the supervisors. And so things were sort of working their way. It was the first time in Fluvanna County's history that there had been this kind of public-private partnership. And it has led to, I think, many of the things that, excuse me, that we have been able to do in the county subsequent to that. I then got a $25,000 grant from the National Park Service. We had been very successful in Maryland in establishing heritage areas, especially at the lower eastern shore of Maryland and southern Maryland, where we put together programs where people would come together, discuss what they liked and loved about their area, and then form organizations to protect those things that they liked. So in, I think it was 1999, I got a $25,000 grant from the National Park Service to hold the first ever Heritage Forum here. We involved the community in the planning for it very extensively, and it was held at Camp Friendship at one of their big meeting rooms. And we tried to involve every element of the community in it, and all of our elected officials, both state, federal, and local. And 300 people showed up that day, and the purpose of that was really quite simple. It was to ask the people of Fluvanna County in a structured environment what it was that they valued in Fluvanna County, and what it was that brought them here, and what they wanted us to help preserve. And of course, open space was the big winner. The Fluvanna River was second. People really, really do identify with the Fluvanna River. We had a little bit of challenge getting people to turn out from the lake for that program, because it was at that stage it was a little difficult to communicate within the lake, but we did have a sizable turnout from people who lived within the lake. And the Park Service paid, as part of their grant, paid for the printing of the summary of that Heritage Forum, which is sitting on the shelf right over there. And a couple of years later, we held the second one, which was also well attended. And the idea of that was to sort of perfect the ideas that had been agreed upon by the people in the first Heritage Forum. It was about that time, about 1999, that VDOT told the county that it was going to replace the old steel truss bridge, which was really a nice bridge. I tried to save it even as the new bridge was being built because it was a bit of a historic element of here, and I wanted to make it into a footbridge, but that went nowhere, unfortunately. At the time that they were beginning to think about putting the new bridge, we had just finished the master plan for the Heritage Trail, and in that master plan was to have the trail over the new bridge, which is sort of also a bit of a revolutionary idea. So I went to the supervisors and I suggested that the supervisors appoint an advisory committee to advise VDOT about the new bridge. And I suggested that they have most of the people on this committee would be the two supervisors, and they selected me to be the third person on this advisory committee. Fortunately, at that stage, this is a real anachronism in today's political world. We were represented in the House of Delegates by a man named Delegate Earl Dickinson. Earl Dickinson was a marvel. The first time I met him was at a county fair, and I thought, this is a really good old boy. And I discovered this is one sharp, good old boy. He was brilliant, and he was very effective. He also happened to be chairman of the House of Delegates Appropriations Committee, so he controlled the funding, including the funding for Virginia Department of Transportation. So I went to him. I mean, he was a Democrat, and I'm a Democrat. I went to him and I said, Earl, I would like to make this new bridge be very similar to a bridge that had been washed out up in I think it's in Madison County, I'm not sure. But it was in an area that was part of a Civil War battlefield. And the locals up there convinced VDOT to make the replacement bridge to have a trail on it, and also to line it in faux stone, and to make it compatible with the battlefield that surrounded it. And so we went to VDOT and we said, look, the Palmyra Courthouse district is on the National Register of Historic Places. This is a very historic site, and you ought to be designing a bridge that fits in with the location of the bridge. There were various machinations that went through, and I won't go into all of that. I would probably be in federal prison if I went through it, so I'll just sort of skip that part.
I remember part of the story.
Our cameraman is smiling. At any rate, we essentially wrote a letter to VDOT and said, you must do the following with the new bridge. You will copy the bridge in the Civil War battlefield up north. You will have the new Heritage Trail on it, and it will have 4 overlooks looking upstream with historic markers, 2 historic markers in each one of the overlooks. And because Earl was leading the parade, they couldn't say no. So we got the new bridge, and Governor Tim Kaine came to dedicate it and won the prize that year, or the award, for being the best designed new transportation project in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and indeed it was. So had we not done already the work of setting up a master plan for the Heritage Trail, had we not already done one successful transportation enhancement grant, VDOT would have looked at me and of us and said, no way are we going to do this. But because of Earl and because of our already existing history of doing projects on a relatively large scale successfully, I think they were impressed enough to see that they could do something that would be honored in the future for many, many years. So that's sort of the story of the bridge. I think the idea of making the public-private partnership between the Historical Society and the Heritage Trail and the county work, that Pleasant Grove was the ideal mechanism for doing that. You had this 969-acre beautiful property. It was clearly the county was interested in whatever was put here at Pleasant Grove, that it be well designed, that it be in traditional architecture, as you can see from the library where we're recording this. The sheriff's office, which abuts this, is also designed in a very traditional style, and that there were other opportunities. So I, by that time, was president of the Historical Society, and I went to the supervisors and I said, I think you need, or I would suggest that you think long-term about Pleasant Grove. And one of the first things that I think you ought to do is to put the Pleasant Grove house and the 5 acres surrounding it on the National Register of Historic Places. Meanwhile, I had put my house on the National Register of Historic Places and all 187 acres at my place under a historic easement. The Historical Society was holding public meetings with landowners in Fluvanna County who owned 100 acres or more of land, providing information to them about the benefits of a conservation easement. Conservation easements are fantastic in Virginia because there are big financial inducements for doing that. When I put my house under historic easement, I had no idea that there were these financial benefits. But under Virginia law, if you put my 187 acres under an easement, you have given a gift of the development rights of your property to the people of Virginia. And therefore, that has a dollar value, which is a charitable gift. And for people in certain income levels, it's a fantastic thing. So we started getting more and more land in the county under either historic easements or conservation easements, and I think now it's about 10 or 11% of the county is permanently preserved. And those easements go with the property. They cannot be there in perpetuity. You can't just say, well, I'm going to buy this property and develop it. It doesn't work that way. Under Virginia law, you have an easement on it, and you've reaped the financial benefits of having an easement that goes with your property, and you cannot change it, which is really a fantastic thing. So all of that was underway, and the supervisor said, okay, Marvin, we'll put the Pleasant Grove house on the National Register, but we don't have enough money to do it. So Ellen Miyagawa, who was the president of the who had been the president, I had just replaced her and another man as president of the Historical Society, she volunteered to do the application, and she wrote a brilliant application for the Pleasant Grove house, and it and the 5 acres surrounding it were put on the National Register of Historic Places. Why is that important? It's important because foundations are prone to give money to projects where the owner, in this case Fluvanna County, has done something to preserve the being on the National Register of Historic Places doesn't guarantee the preservation of the property. It just is an honorific sort of title for the property. But it makes it much easier for people such as myself to raise money to restore it. So we started with the Heritage Trail. The little summer kitchen that's next to the Pleasant Grove House was literally falling apart. So we wrote, by this time the county had hired, to my great surprise and joy, a grants administrator, Pat Groot, who was terrific. And so she wrote the T21 grant to restore the Pleasant Grove House. That was very expensive because the summer kitchen had no foundation, so the whole thing was rotting. And in order to preserve it, they had to jack it up, build a foundation under it, and then lower the building back down. So it cost about $200,000 just to restore that little place. But the method behind my madness, or the madness behind my method, either way, was that if I got the summer kitchen restored, it would certainly be an inducement to restore the manor house itself. So, and I think the supervisors saw through what I was trying to do. I mean, it was sort of like, we know what you're up to, Marvin. So then we set to work raising the money to restore the Pleasant Grove House. And that was a major project. I think I got grants from 5 or 6 different foundations. And then we got 2 transportation enhancement grants for it. And the project in the end cost $1.1 million. And Pat Groot and I raised $878,000 for it. So that whole restoration was done at a minimal cost. I mean, it was still a substantial amount of money that the people of Fluvanna County put into it. I don't minimize that. But it would not have been made possible had we not had this public-private partnership. That was the thing that drove it. And the foundations I went to had already given us grants for the summer kitchen and for trail enhancement and other things. So we had a track record with them. And to a certain extent, that's why I think we were so successful in fundraising for the Pleasant Grove House, because we were going to people who already had a great deal of trust in the Historical Society and the Heritage Trail and its ability to work with Fluvanna County. I think a lot of local people, I think they admire what we've done. I don't think there's any question about that. But I also think, to a certain extent, they still don't understand how these public-private partnerships work, because they are very complex. There's not a single simple part of it. And I had to convince, when we were doing the Pleasant Grove House, I went to the supervisors and I said, I cannot raise a cent for this project unless you put up a substantial amount of county seed money. The owner has to have some cards in the game in order for you to succeed in raising money for a project. And to their credit, they did that, and it was possible to do. Probably the major project, by that time I was on the Board of Supervisors, and from 2004 to 2009, and 2008 and 2009 I was the chair, and I was elected on the platform with the majority of the supervisors sharing that platform to build a new high school. By that time, the old high school was dated. It needed all kinds of structural improvements. And the county was still, at that time, growing very rapidly. It is not growing very rapidly now, but it is still growing, but not anywhere near the period of 1995 to about 2010, which was the real spurt in growth that we had to manage. So the high school, from my point of view, was absolutely essential. And it was interesting because the school board, and the superintendent appointed an advisory group with several supervisors and lots of school teachers and people from the community who were not employees of the school board or school teachers to come up with a concept for the high school. I went to a lot of those meetings, and quite frankly, the concepts were so modern from my high school days. I'm not sure that I really understood them, but it was making certain disciplinary nodes where you would be doing either languages or something of that nature, even to the point of how you designed where the students' lockers were. The new rule was that the lockers had to be not narrow hallways, but very wide hallways, so that the students were bumping into each other and interacting, and all of those things, of course, added a bit to the cost of the high school. It was extremely controversial. And the other major growth project at that time, which I was a leader in, was the lack of water at Zion Crossroads and the 250 corridor to begin commercial development in the area where it logically belonged. And we were well on our way in 2008 and 2009 to be working with Louisa County on a joint project which would be mutually funded by the two counties. And it's hard to imagine, but we were talking about a very expensive water project in conjunction with Louisa. At the same time, we were building a $70 million high school. So no wonder there was controversy about this. And Mr. Moss, the big spender from the north, had come down here and was busily putting the taxpayers of Fluvanna County in debt for the rest of their lives. I was defeated for re-election in 2009 by 30-some votes, which is a blessing in a way because I've been able to devote more time to other nonprofit activities. So here you had Pleasant Grove, you had all the things that we've done at Pleasant Grove, the new bridge, and the two major capital projects that were related directly to the rapid growth, the high school and the need for developing a more solid tax base in the areas that needed utilities. And as you know now, that is underway. They finally have gotten some of this under the way, and I applaud them for doing that. I think it's Fluvanna County at one stage had the highest percentage of, well, I'll put it another way. We had the lowest percentage of tax base being commercial of any county in this region. Mm-hmm. The other thing that was a major change for Fluvanna County was, especially as Lake Monticello grew. Right now, 43% of Fluvanna's population lives in the gated community of Lake Monticello, or the areas that are at Lake Monticello that are outside the gates. It caused a sea change in the way people lived. The sea change was caused as much as anything by the fact that there were not many jobs here in Fluvanna County. So right now, about 60% of all employable people in Fluvanna County commute to work outside of Fluvanna County, which causes all kinds of ancillary problems. Just as an example, as that began to develop, and you had two mom and dad working families, both perhaps going in different directions and coming back at night, we had a fire and rescue system that was totally dependent on volunteers. And it was becoming increasingly difficult to get volunteers for the fire and also the rescue squads. When we designed the new, we have built three new fire stations in the last decade or so. And all three of those fire stations were designed with an upstairs as rooms for future growth, when you would have non-volunteers or professional firemen who would be actually staying there overnight. So we sort of anticipated that in the design of the new fire stations, to recognizing that we have to go at some stage to a mixed force of volunteers and professionals, and we have done that. Now several of our ambulance crews are University of Virginia trained emergency medical technicians, and we have a mixed force of volunteers and professional people, which is working very well, I think. But those are the things that you don't think about as you have rapid growth. You don't think about the volunteers and fire stations and things of that nature. So I've been rattling on now for a long time.
One of the things that we talked about was very interesting was the courthouse.
Yeah.
Do you remember?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, that was a big controversy. Of course, to go back to ancient history, in 1994, when the supervisors very wisely bought Pleasant Grove, they bought it for the wrong reason. They wanted to put the new courthouse over here. Unfortunately, they had not researched the state law very well, because the state law said that a new courthouse has to be physically contiguous to the old. It just so happened there's a thing called the Fluvanna River that separates Palmyra from Pleasant Grove. So in order to overcome that obstacle, the county had one option. It could go to a referendum to overcome that obstacle. And the supervisors unanimously approved a referendum to move the courthouse to Pleasant Grove. And it was defeated 2-1 by the citizens. And the defeat was based on some historic preservationists, including me. I wanted the courthouse to remain in Palmyra. But also the aftermath of the people who were very fiscal conservatives, who were angry that they bought Pleasant Grove to begin with. So that combination was deadly. So then the supervisors had no choice but except to put the new courthouse in the village of Palmyra. And they bought a property, and fortunately they were able to get a property at a fairly reasonable rate to build the new courthouse there, and also to design it to be compatible with the historic courthouse. So it worked out well. But then, of course, they had 969 acres to deal with, which is the rest of Pleasant Grove. And then we started planning, filling out the master plan. And I don't think this was in the minds of the supervisors, even by 2000, that if they had to build a new high school, or if they went in the direction of building a new high school, that Pleasant Grove would be the ideal spot for it. First of all, it's rather central in the county. And secondly, property values of raw land in Fluvanna had increased a great deal. So buying 150 acres for a new high school was going to cost a fair amount of money. So they very wisely decided to, I think the county deeded 65 acres for the new high school to the school board. So the school board actually owns that land now where the high school is. But it saved a lot of money by not having to purchase land for the high school. I'm not sure that I answered your courthouse.
Well, yeah, because we were talked about that it was supposed to be over here, but they didn't understand about
Yeah.
to be contiguous.
Yeah. It was serendipitous that it turned out the way it did, I think, because they had more room over here to build government buildings. I mean, and they planned it beautifully. I mean, the entrance to this library where we're sitting, to put those roundabouts in, they were put in because there was always the possibility that you were going to build more government buildings around those roundabouts. So from a planning point of view, it was really quite brilliant. And the county did that all on its own. I mean, they were the ones who came up with that idea of building the 2 roundabouts that come into here. And we've only built 2 of the buildings here, the sheriff's office and this library. So I think that the theme of rapid growth, I think I've pretty much exhausted, but I think one of the things that you can't overemphasize is how difficult it was to transition from a very conservative, fiscally conservative government that was not used to reaching out for funds elsewhere to go in the direction of recognizing that they could do these things with new programs and new ideas. It took a little while for them to understand this, and that's not at all surprising. I mean, this county had been governed essentially the same way for almost 200 years. And it was well governed. I mean, there was no question about that. I mean, we were very fortunate to have very good public elected officials throughout, I think.
Do we have time for one more question? You have a little story that you told me about the design of a new firehouse. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
I thought that was quite interesting. Do you care to share?
Yeah. It's interesting. We hired young architects from a firm in Charlottesville, and they did a bang-up job of this is the Palmyra fire station. I was not on the Board of Supervisors when it was decided that we needed a new fire station. And the old fire station was in the basement of the building where the county government is now. I mean, it was a dank, awful place. So was the sheriff's office there. It was probably met no sanitary standards at all whatsoever. Anyway, I was attending most of the Board of Supervisors meetings in those days, and they came up with this. It was a steel butler building design for the new station. And I was thinking to myself, whoa, this is on Route 15. It's the entrance, literally, to the historic village of Palmyra. And we're going to have a steel butler building there? I said, I hope not. So I went to Cecil Cobb, who is a dear friend of mine, who was at that time the chair of the Board of Supervisors. And I said, Cecil, can we do something about this? So he appointed a committee, including me and a couple of other people, to begin and agreed to hire an architect to design a new station. They made the bold decision of including the dormitory space there for future use of professional firefighters. And so I was so happy that as this design developed, it was really a quite beautiful building. And I think people think that, yeah, Marvin's making the building beautiful instead of just functional, that it costs an arm and a leg to do that. And it really does not. It costs more, there's no question about that, but you can make a beautiful building out of we did it here for this library. The original design of this library was hideous. And I was on the committee for this too, and we worked to make it into a nice looking building. But in the end, the young architects called me and Cecil, and they said, you know, the south end of the building was not brick. It was just plain with no windows. And they said, what do you think we can do about that? We were all standing there. And I said to the young architect, I said, give me your pad and I drew John Hartwell Cox's blind arches, which are on the old Treasurer's building next to the historic courthouse. And I said, put these on there with stucco. And they said, oh. So he went down and copied the exact dimensions of the John Hartwell Cox blind arches. And he sent it back, and he had them all the same height. And I said, no, make them arch up to the top. And when it was finished, one wag who was on the county staff, a friend of mine at the time, says, you know something, Marvin, it looks a little bit like a Mexican restaurant. I said, okay, I'll take that as not a compliment, but not a. So yeah, that station was, a fire station was another experiment in doing something the right way. And it worked out, I think, very well. I mean, it could have been hideous, you know. But I just want to conclude by saying I've been talking a lot about myself. In actuality, none of this could have occurred without lots of people supporting these efforts, both in our nonprofits, but also the elected officials themselves. I mean, the elected officials became open to these things because they saw it was succeeding. And that was, perhaps for me, the most fulfilling thing about this whole period in my retirement was people said, hey, we can go to the I would be sitting in the board of supervisors meetings after my defeat, and they'd say, we'd like to do so and so, and they'd see me back there, and Don Weaver would say, Marvin can do it. And sometimes I'd say, no, Marvin can't do it. Depends on what it is. But no, I mean, this county has done a fabulous job. I have brought other elected officials from Albemarle and Charlottesville here to see Pleasant Grove and what we've done in the village, and they're flabbergasted by it. They said, how do you do this? This is absolutely, it's one of the greatest parks and government centers imaginable, beautifully designed, beautifully put together. So everybody in this county ought to be very proud of that, because it was the citizens who were on that advisory committee back in 1995, 1996, who said, this is too valuable and too important to let be ruined by bad planning. Do it the right way. So it was the citizens who drove that.
Well, sir, I want to thank you greatly for your time
Yeah.
and the learning experience that you're providing for us and for future generations.
I hope so, yes.
Thank you.
My pleasure.